I've already made a video about iron sights and one about early sporting shotgun optics. This video will essentially be part 3 in this series. I will be talking about early scopes, their reticles, and how they were mounted. O'Connor also goes over the various kinds of reticles available in 1940, as well as their strengths and weaknesses. The crosshair type of reticle has two virtues. They blot out less of the target, which makes holding over for elevation easier, and they are generally more accurate because of the fine aiming point. However, dim light and quick-moving animals require a different kind of reticle, something that is more obvious in low light and similarly quicker to use on fast-moving animals. The tapered post reticle and the tapered post with crosshairs are excellent in O'Connor's opinion. The tip of the post does not fade out in low light like the sharp picket post does, and they still have a more precise aiming point than the blunt post. These reticles are only slightly less accurate than crosshairs, and they are more readily seen. He believes that the average hunter is not served well with a reticle equipped with bullet drop dots on the grounds that it adds complexity and distraction. He holds that simplicity is best because it doesn't tax the brain. Years later, O'Connor explains that he changed his preference to a lead-dot reticle on the basis that he finds it easier to use on running game because it doesn't blot out the game, and because it is easier to maintain the elevation with. He also recommends the lead dot for use in brush because the reticle is more easily seen. In 1945, O'Connor explained that a few years ago the agreement was almost universal that the best reticle for the hunting scope was the flat top post. It was very good because of its simplicity, and it may have also been popular because of its resemblance to a front sight blade when seen through a peep sight. O'Connor reasoned that most scope users had switched from receiver peep sights to a scope and wanted something that looked more or less familiar. That is one of the reasons that O'Connor favored the flat top post at least. The flat post has its downsides though. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to make accurate holdovers at long range on game like sheep or antelope. Because of its size, the reticle blocks out too much of the animal at long range. Second of all, there is a lack of a vertical reference point that could be used to help comprehend where the aiming point should be placed in order to get the proper elevation. This prevents quick and accurate shooting from being accomplished at long range. In comparison, O'Connor finds the two best reticles for medium and long range shooting in the West to be the medium crosshairs and the lead dot. Both of these reticles have great advantages over the post. First of all, holding over becomes enormously simplified because the horizontal crosshair gives a point of reference in judging elevation, and the vertical crosshair gives a point of reference that helps you judge lead on a running target. In addition to this, the lead dot has the great advantage in that the dot can be used as a point of size comparison to judge at what range the animal is at. This requires practice and getting used to, of course, but once you have got the hang of it, is quite useful. Because of its ability to help judge range and the ease of holding over on animals, O'Connor is convinced that the lead dot is the best of all reticles for long-range open country shooting. Since the average whitetail measures about 16 inches from the bottom to the top of his chest, O'Connor explains that you can combine that knowledge with the reticle size to roughly guess range. Deer number 1 is roughly 400 yards away, and the 4 MOA dot is 16 MOA at that distance. Of course, a 4 MOA dot is 4 minutes of angle at 100 yards, and as distance is multiplied by 4 and becomes 400 yards, the dot size is also multiplied by 4. The dot completely and perfectly covers the chest of the average whitetail at that range. At roughly 300 yards, deer number 2 has a 12 MOA dot on him, which would roughly cover 3/4 of his chest. Deer number 3 is only 200 yards away, so the dot is only 8 MOA and covers half his chest. Deer number 4 is roughly 100 yards away, and the 4 MOA dot only covers roughly 1/4 of his chest. He recommends a 4-minute of angle size dot for ordinary 2 1/4 or 2 3/5 power hunting scopes made for fairly long range shots. The reason is that in dim light, a smaller dot is harder to see, and a larger dot obstructs too much of the target. For the same level of minimal target obstruction, a 4-power scope should have a 2 1/2 or 3-minute of angle dot. For shooting stationary varmints with a 6 or 8-power scope, a 1 or 1 1/2 MOA dot should be used for optimal precision. The dot enables quick and intuitive shooting because it's very visible, allowing your eye to find it quickly. Second of all, it's more intuitive than the post during quick shooting because you aim with the whole dot. In comparison, you don't aim with the whole post, just the very tip of the post, which is the least obvious part of it due to its insignificant size in relation to the rest of the post. Therefore, there is a tendency in quick shooting to use the whole post as the aiming point, and as a consequence, you tend to overshoot the target. Deep, V-notch iron sights are similarly unsuitable for fast shooting because they also invite overshooting. Using a chevron or triangle reticle with a horizontal crosshair would greatly reduce the overshooting effect. Like the Lee dot, you would still instinctively aim with the whole chevron. However, it would not erase the overshooting effect completely because the fine point of the chevron or triangle is still less prominent. In addition, the point of the chevron or triangle is still just above the perceptual center of the reticle, which is the center of the triangle itself. This means simple chevrons or triangles are not as intuitive or accurate when used quickly. In comparison, a circle dot reticle is perfect for fast shooting because the dot is squarely located in the perceptual center of the outer circle reticle. Of course, literally and technically speaking, the aiming points of both the chevron and the circle dot are both in the center of the scope. O'Connor believes that the post is the only reticle that shows up well enough in deep woods, so he'll continue to recommend the post to deer hunters in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. However, he points out that he has shot moose in dim light with the Lee dot. He concludes that the man that does most of his shooting in dimly lit woods should use a 5 or 6 minute dot with crosshairs that are somewhat coarser than standard. If he does this, O'Connor is convinced that he will shoot running game just as fast with the post reticle, yet he will have more accuracy. Continuing with the theme of reticle visibility, O'Connor explains that during his hunting in the Yukon, where the sun was low and the days were often cloudy, the fine crosshairs of his Leichert Eagle scope showed up poorly, and he was afraid to use it much. In comparison, the 4 MOA dot showed up well, even under those same conditions, to the point that it could be used against a black bear in the timber. He concludes that if you're using regular crosshairs and not a reticle that has a dot, you want to have medium crosshairs that are 3/4 to 1 MOA thick. Scopes in the past were generally very basic. A seamless metal tube held a front-facing objective lens that projected an upside-down image to the inverter lens, which corrected the image that would be viewed through the eyepiece lens, which holds the reticle. Many scopes made in the past did not have any way to adjust for windage or elevation inside the scope itself. These adjustments had to be done externally with the scope mount. On scopes that had internal adjustment, some of them used the ocular lens to accomplish this, while at least one used the inverter lens and others used the objective lens. It is also worth mentioning that the Noski scope manufacturer used to sell a 4-power objective that would convert a standard 2 1/4 power Noski scope into a 4-power one. Similarly, R.A. Leichert has made various objectives that boost the magnification of Weaver scopes. One incident in particular changed how Noski scope mounts were made. A famous eastern sportsman was going to Alaska to hunt moose. He found exactly the moose he wanted with record antlers and proceeded to empty his rifle at the animal without landing a single hit. He found out later that his guide had never seen such a thing as a scope with external adjustments and fiddled with the windage screw. The sportsman talked to Rudolf Noski about his woes, and Rudolf apparently changed something to make the windage harder to tamper with. The next section talks about how transverse screws were originally finger adjustable in order so that they could be used during an emergency. However, this feature led to people always tightening them with their fingers, presumably using more force than necessary, which led to burrs. Because of this, Rudolf switched to screws that could only be turned with a coin. Presumably, this also applied to the previously mentioned windage adjustment on scope mounts. As far as I'm aware, it was Noski scopes that introduced the revolutionary idea of being able to adjust both windage and elevation within the scope itself, as well as screw-on caps that prevent the turrets from being tampered with or bumped out of zero on brush. O'Connor continues and explains that it used to be the case that scopes were mounted high off the rifle in order to prevent the bolt handle of the Winchester Model 54s and Springfields from hitting the scope. This was really not a satisfactory solution. The major problem was that your face was off the comb of the stock, and because of that you did not have a consistent cheek weld. Therefore, your perception of the reticle in relation to the target was constantly changing and degrading your practical accuracy. Later in 1947, there was a brief mention in Outdoor Life about a novel solution to this problem. This was a German invention that allowed part of the stock to be raised significantly higher in order that your cheek and eye would be in line with the scope even if a very high scope mount was used. This was a very good idea, but the name of the inventor of this integral cheek riser was noticeably absent. High scope mounts did have a small benefit in that you could easily use the iron sights below the scope if your scope lens got smudged or wet. Practically speaking, though, this wasn't a huge advantage for the average person because it isn't very hard to keep your scope clean and dry unless you live somewhere like the Pacific Northwest or parts of Alaska that frequently rain. The stiff scope mount has a tube that extends over the objective lens and prevents snow or rain from getting on the lens. Likewise, you could keep the lens caps on your rifle until you get ready to shoot. Also, scopes were not sealed back then, so if you got your scope really wet, probably some of that water got into the scope itself. You'd obviously have to find a way to dry out your scope. And if you wanted to put it in the sun, that wouldn't be a good idea because the sun degrades the glue that holds the lenses and everything in place. O'Connor dispels the common misconception by explaining that with a high scope mount, the scope is less likely to be damaged or knocked about than the front sight. He has a point, obviously. Military rifles almost had some sort of sight guard, but sporting rifles were not held to the same standard. We could also draw a parallel and point out that it was common for military rifles to have steel butt plates as a durability upgrade, but that was not the standard for sporting rifles. In fact, when military rifles were sporterized or modified to be suitable for sporting use, the ears or wings that protect the sights were sometimes milled off in order to put sporting sights on. An example of this is the 1917 Enfield shown in this picture. This highlights the disparity between what some sportsmen desire and what militaries desire. Since the high scope mount did not really prove to be satisfactory, people had to figure out something else. Broadly speaking, as time progressed, people moved away from high, quick detach scope mounts to permanent low scope mounts. You could choose a scope like the Noski 2 1/4 power that had eye relief long enough that it could be mounted forward of the bolt handle of a rifle like the Springfield, Mauser, or 54 Winchester, or you could choose to modify your bolt handle and possibly buy an aftermarket safety. For example, with a Hensoldt Zeitel or a Weaver 440 that has only 3 inches of eye relief, it was necessary to modify the bolt handle and get a new safety to get the scope into the proper position and give you the right eye relief. The bolt handles were typically heated with a blowtorch and then bent downwards so that they wouldn't hit the scope when the action was cycled. Obviously, you'd want someone who knew what they were doing, like a gunsmith, for that sort of thing. Many rifles around this time were obviously originally designed for iron sights, and their stocks would put your face too low to be useful for a scope, so you could either choose to buy a new stock or a simple cheek riser that laces onto the rifle. The consensus seemed to be that low-power scopes around 2 or 2 3/4 power were good for big game due to their large field of view. 4-power scopes were also very prevalent. Obviously, you want to have a large field of view so that you can see your target quickly before it gets away. Before low-powered variable optics were popular, people just used low-power scopes with fixed magnification. Jack O'Connor also mentioned an experience in which he had a long eye relief scope mounted on a 30-06 ahead of the bolts. This worked fine for O'Connor because he was used to stock crawling or moving your face farther down the stock. However, O'Connor let a friend, Ken, borrow this rifle, and it was an absolute nightmare for Ken because he was not used to this sort of thing, and consequently he could never get a full field of view. Later, O'Connor decided to quit using scopes mounted ahead of the action because that method resulted in losing some field of view due to limited eye relief. I think it is relevant now to talk about Jeff Cooper and his scout rifle idea. First of all, people will disagree on what should technically be called a scout rifle. I will use the more modern, looser definition of a bolt-action rifle that has a long eye-relief scope mounted forward of the action. The first Scout Rifle Conference happened in 1983. That was when Cooper gathered people together to get their perspectives and tried to push the idea down the path of development. If we take a historical perspective, 1983 was far too late for the Scout rifle to have really gained widespread popularity. Rifles like the Springfield and the Winchester Model 54 had bolt handles that, if left in the stock configuration, would hit low-mounted scopes. As I mentioned before, low-mounted scopes could also interfere with safeties. So if Jeff Cooper came up with the idea for a long eye relief scope that could be mounted forward of the action on rifles like the Springfield and the Winchester Model 54, this would be a very competitive idea as long as it was early enough. In the case of the Springfield, it would be particularly useful because you could still use stripper clips for fast loading since the scope would not be in the way. Let's be precise. World War II ended in 1945. Around 1946 to 1947, material bottlenecks from the war were being eliminated. New companies were appearing and making scopes for the civilian market. The Model 70 Winchester was introduced in 1947 as the improved version of the Model 54. The three notable upgrades relevant to this discussion were the following. They came drilled and tapped from the factory for scope mounts. They had a modified bolt and modified safety that made it possible to use a low scope mount. So 1946 would be the best time for Jeff Cooper to have leveraged his family's significant wealth and connections to invest in a scope manufacturing business with the express purpose of making long eye relief scopes. The problem, of course, was that Jeff Cooper was still serving in the Marine Corps in 1946. The Jeff Cooper Scout rifle idea was roughly 37 years, or 4 decades too late to gain widespread adoption. I'm sure some people think that I'm being reductive by focusing on the long eye relief scope and its position as the only significant attributes of the Scout rifle, but those things are obviously the main difference between a Scout rifle and a regular rifle. I must conclude then that contrary to popular belief, the Scout rifle was not particularly innovative nor ahead of its time, but rather too late to see really widespread use. Perhaps more importantly, arguably Cooper could have made significantly more money off of his idea if he went into the scope making business.